This podcast contains graphic content and may not be suitable for all listeners. Listener discretion is strongly advised.
True North True Crime is produced on the territories of the Coast Salish people.
It's really sad, and that's been my main takeaway from this, is that violence against women and missing women are so frequent and the numbers are so high that we as a society are like, oh no, another one. And for the people who love that person, it's not, oh no, another one. It's, where is my sister? Where is my daughter? And why are people just moving on with their lives when their whole world has stopped? And so after that first conversation with the family, I thought, okay, let me see if I can just start asking some questions, because at that point, the case was about 10 or 11 years old. And the impression I was getting was that the police were present at the time on Bowen Island and in the aftermath of Jodi's disappearance, but then their world also moved on. And, they leave Bowen and they move on to the next case and what have you. So nobody had asked questions in a very long time.
Nestled at the mouth of Howe Sound, Bowen Island is a forested haven just a short ferry ride from Horseshoe Bay. This lush island, with its stunning landscapes and tranquil atmosphere, feels like a world apart from the hustle and bustle of city life. Bowen Island residents love living there, as it can feel like its own remote nation separate from Metro Vancouver. For many years, the island was also a secret party spot for teens and young adults. When the last ferry sailed away from the island, there was a feeling of freedom. For the next few hours, the island was theirs. Free from their parents, free from judgment. After a night of partying, 17-year-old Jodi Henrickson walked slowly down the road, leaning against her on-again, off-again boyfriend, Gavin Arnott. A motorist on their way to the first ferry that morning remembers seeing the young couple. While Gavin made it home that morning, Jodi did not. It has now been 15 years, and Jodi has not been seen or heard from since. In this episode, we present part 1 of the disappearance of Jodi Henrickson, and you are listening to True North True Crime.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 101 of True North True Crime. Whether you are a longtime listener or new to our podcast, we want to welcome you and thank you for tuning in. This is going to be part 1 of a 2-part series. Part 2 is going to be in your feeds tomorrow, so be sure to check back bright and early in the morning for that. For those of you who want more True North True Crime, for $5 a month, you can get early access to the podcast on Mondays instead of Thursdays, plus ad-free listening and bonus content if you sign up for TNTC Plus on Apple Podcasts or over on Patreon. If you'd like to try out TNTC Plus, there is a free 7-day trial option on Apple Podcasts that you can go check out. We want to remind everyone that regularly released episodes of our podcast are always free and are always going to be free, and they come out every 2 weeks, as they have since we started the podcast 4 years ago. If you have a case suggestion for us, you can always reach out to truenorthtruecrime@gmail.com. We do prioritize cases from family members or close contacts of a case, but welcome suggestions and emails from all of our listeners. Okay, with that, let's get into the disappearance of Jodi Henrickson.
So in this 2-part series, we are discussing the disappearance of 17-year-old Jodi Henrickson. Jodi was last seen in the early morning hours of Saturday, June 20th, 2009 on Bowen Island in the province of British Columbia, Canada. Jodi was last known to be in the company of her 20-year-old boyfriend, Gavin Arnott. However, Gavin claims that the two became separated after some sort of disagreement, and that he has not seen her since that morning. Despite searches and a lengthy investigation, Jodi has never been found, and unfortunately, the trail, as they say, has gone cold. However, a new 4-part documentary series hopes to uncover new details and narrow the focus of the investigation with one goal in mind: to help find Jodi Henrickson. Our hope with this episode is to bring Jodi back to mind, to increase awareness of her case and possibly generate some tips from those who have still been holding out information. It's been 15 years, and it's time for those responsible for her disappearance to bring some answers for Jodi's family. For this episode, we spoke at length with journalist, filmmaker, and documentarian Jenni Baynham, who is the executive producer of the new documentary. Through Jenni, we were able to speak with Peter Cross, the former lead investigator on the Jodi Henrickson file. Additionally, we used publicly available court records and news articles to inform this episode. We want to especially highlight the work of Neil Boyd. Neil wrote an article in 2011 about Jodi's disappearance that has been widely cited over the years for his exceptional research. As an additional content warning, this episode deals with gender-based violence against women and intimate partner violence, as well as the disappearance of a 17-year-old girl. For this episode, and to get the most accurate information out there, we spoke with Peter Cross, who was at one point the lead investigator on this file. Here's Peter with a little bit about his long career as a homicide investigator.
I was an RCMP officer for 34 years. Figured, give or take a month or two. And the last part of that, I would say a good 20 years of that was primarily all in homicide. And starting off with serious crime in North Vancouver, then serious crime in Surrey, and then serious crime there basically was homicide. I did that for 10 years. Then I went to IHIT for 5 years. Yeah, so a lot of 200 plus homicides probably in a number of years. And that's sort of my background. Now, the interesting part in terms of this thing was that the Bowen Island file, the Jodi file, was my last homicide file. If you're assuming it's a homicide as opposed to a missing person, which is still technically, it's still a missing person file, right?
So Jodi's case was Peter's last file, and as you can imagine, Peter has a strong desire to find a resolution on this case. Peter is not just any homicide cop. He is actually one of the founding members of IHIT. Those in British Columbia will know IHIT as the Integrated Homicide Investigation Team. It's a unit that's dedicated to solving homicides in the lower mainland of British Columbia, which covers 29 RCMP communities and 4 municipal police forces. The basic concept of IHIT is to share resources between partner municipalities to solve murder cases that fall into its criteria. Now, IHIT also takes suspicious missing person cases, especially ones that fit their mandate. Since its inception in 2003, IHIT has led over 1,000 homicide investigations. We asked Peter how he became involved in the documentary, looking into Jodi's case. He shared with us that he met Jenni Baynham, and the two shared a common desire to find Jodi.
I met Jenni about a year and a half ago, and she got hold of me, asked if I was be interested in talking to her because she had developed this interest in the file from a couple years previous to that. So I said, sure, I talked to her, and that led to a bit of a friendship, and then me volunteering to help out with her research and the making of the documentary. So that's how we came to this level. I have some advantage in that since I was on the file originally 15 years ago, I have some internal knowledge that normally she wouldn't be exposed to, or the documentary wouldn't have access to. But I also have to walk that fine line where I can't reveal too much that is confidential on the file, still to this day, right? So I don't have access to the police file, even though I was one of the originators on it 15 years ago. So that's sort of the unique position I'm in.
As for Jenni Baynham, the documentarian, her journey to this subject was not a straight line. As a journalist and TV producer, her career started in Glasgow, Scotland, before she made the move to Vancouver over 10 years ago.
Who am I, personally or professionally? Okay. My name is Jenni Baynham. I'm originally from Glasgow, Scotland, but I've lived in Vancouver for the last 10 years. And I always say to people where I'm from because I think my accent trips them out, especially when I'm dealing with anonymous calls and they're like, where am I calling? No, it's Vancouver. I have been a television and film producer for about the last decade. I was a journalist before that. I used to specialize in unscripted TV. And by that, I'm talking like Love It or List It, HGTV, like the fun stuff. And then I moved into movies, again, fun, lighthearted, feel-good movies. And then 4 years ago, someone told me the story of Jodi Henrickson, and I fell off the deep end on an unsolved true crime case.
So as a producer for unscripted shows such as Love It or List It or feel-good Hallmark movies like Baking Spirits Bright, Jenni's production company is not known for true crime content. So it begged the question of how she became involved in producing a docuseries about a missing BC teenager.
So my business partner for the production company has a friend called Amelia Thomas. She's a journalist. And 4 years ago, she was telling us about the story of Jodi Henrickson, and she was considering writing a book because she had moved to Bowen with her husband and children for peace and quiet. They had lived all over the world, and she wanted to pick somewhere that was the most peaceful place on earth. 4 days after they moved, Jodi Henrickson went missing and was last seen basically outside Amelia's house on Miller Road. And it never sat well with her that a girl went missing on her doorstep and was never found. And police say that Jodi never left the island. And when Amelia was telling me that story, I just couldn't wrap my head around it. Bowen Island is less than 50 square kilometers. And I was thinking, how did they never find her? How did they never find her? How does a 17-year-old go missing on a 50 square kilometer island and you never find her? So Amelia and my business partner and I partnered up on, okay, let's start looking into this a little more. Let's start digging. We'll keep it kind of low key and undercover just now because who knows if there's a story there, you know? The first thing we did was reach out to her family. I would never do something like this without the family being involved. It was very foreign territory for me. I've never made a true crime documentary before. I didn't even know if I was about to make a true crime documentary. I just knew that I had to find out more about this case. Her family were so lovely, are so lovely. And their perspective was anyone talking about Jodi is a win for us because they had just felt like many missing women that people don't really care. And it's sad.
Jodi Henrickson grew up in the mountain town of Squamish, British Columbia. There are a few communities involved in this case that are quite different and unique, but also seem interconnected when you look deeper. Those communities include Squamish, Horseshoe Bay, West Vancouver, and Bowen Island. But Squamish, British Columbia is a district municipality located at the northern end of Howe Sound with a population of approximately 23,000 residents. Known for its stunning natural beauty and outdoor recreation opportunities, Squamish is often referred to as the outdoor recreation capital of Canada. Situated just 58 kilometers south of the world-renowned Whistler Ski Resort, Squamish offers a lot of scenery. It's famed for its breathtaking views of coastal mountains, dense forests, and sparkling waters. For many years, Squamish was a place where blue-collar families raised their kids and enjoyed careers in forestry, the environment, and natural resource extraction. Many people also work at the Squamish Port, a shipping terminal that handles import and exports of bulk goods. When the pulp and sawmill closed in 2006, this opened the door to a new industry: tourism and real estate. After the world discovered Squamish during the 2010 Winter Olympics, everything changed. People from all over began to relocate to Squamish, choosing to commute 1 hour into Vancouver every day for work. This drove up real estate pricing and made Squamish an unlikely bedroom community of Metro Vancouver. So Jodi grew up in the pre-Olympic Squamish, arguably a more idyllic version of the mountain town.
Jodi was born on February 23, 1992. Jodi's father, Bo Henrickson, worked as a longshoreman at the Squamish port. Her mother, Nancy, raised the children, whom included Jodi, her older brother, Rob, and her younger brother, Dylan. Jodi was a petite girl, just 5'3" tall. She had long, flowing brown hair and brown eyes. When she laughed or smiled, you couldn't help but notice the braces that covered her teeth. At the age of 17, she knew that she only had to have them for a few more months, and like many of us who were kids with braces, Jodi was looking forward to the day where they would finally be removed. Jodi attended House Sound Secondary School in the heart of Squamish. She had a large group of friends and was a very social person. Her social instincts and talents were well known. Most of the time, that was a good thing, but sometimes it could lead to teen drama. One friend stated she was very spontaneous. She would sometimes do unexpected things. She could take off with someone she'd just met. Jodi loved music and she loved to draw. Most people in her friend circle and family to this day still have drawings in their possessions that were gifted to them by Jodi. She loved makeup, doing her hair, and getting dressed up. One year for Halloween, Jodi and her friends dressed up as the musical group the Pussycat Dolls, and her two closest friends, Chelsea and Tiffany, remembered that Jodi was notorious for giving people nicknames. But whether you loved or hated it, when Jodi gave you a nickname, it stuck. Chelsea was known as Chelseakins and Tiffany was called Tasman, while Jodi was called the Jodinator because she worked at Wendy's when the Baconator was a big thing. At school, Jodi loved English but hated math. She wasn't necessarily what you would call a great student, but she went to school and found her passions and her friends there. Outside of school, she worked at Wendy's and loved her dog, Panda. But if there was something that Jodi loved the most, it would be her family. But despite her love for her family, there was conflict in the household between Jodi and her parents. The majority of this conflict surrounded Jodi's desire to see her boyfriend. In the initial months after Jodi's disappearance, she was painted as a bit of a troubled teen, a moniker that's easy to place on a 17-year-old child. It makes it easier for people to justify a disappearance by stating, well, they were troubled. Jenni heard this a lot when she first approached the documentary, and she wanted to get to the root of where this insinuation of her being a troubled teen came from.
So Jodi Henrickson is from Squamish. She has really wonderful, lovely parents, Bob and Nancy. She has two brothers, Rob and Dylan. And I think what I learned the most during all of this is I have tried to be really open-minded from the get-go on maybe the person everyone's talking about didn't do it. And I have to really look into that. And maybe, this happened or that happened, and I have to be open. And one of the things I realized was very early on in this investigation, I had read a magazine article or newspaper article that quoted someone involved with the case's mum, who said that Jodi probably ran away because she was a troubled kid. And that had given me inherent bias over the type of person Jodi was. And even though I didn't mean to, I just, I think we all do. And I think that victim blaming is prevalent in our society. And I didn't even know that I was also doing it because I was thinking, oh, well, she was a troubled kid or, oh, whatever. But then I got so close to her two best friends from that time, Tiffany and Chelsea, and her family. And I realized, first of all, that was nonsense. And I can talk about that in a second. But secondly, Jodi was funny and confident and beautiful and had body issues and was a great friend or sometimes a bad friend and had her cell phone cut off because she didn't get a job when her mum told her she had to get a job, and liked Tom Petty and Cascada, and was a person who was funny and loved and popular. And that to me is like, this was a person, and she's 2 years younger than me. And I think about that all the time. And a lot of the witnesses and the sources that I speak to, it's something they bring up a lot. Like, now she would probably be married and have kids. And I think, well, yeah, she would, because I did. And so this wasn't some scenario where, oh, it was a troubled kid and this is what happens to troubled kids. And by the way, see, even if it was a troubled person or someone struggling with addiction or someone whatever, we should still care. We should still care. But I think for me, I've just got to know her so well over the last 4 years that was surprising to me.
I think we can all agree that we made mistakes as teens and as young people. Heck, many of us still continue to make mistakes through our adulthood. But up until now, one or two bad decisions has not led to us being taken away from our loved ones. Peter echoed Jenni's thoughts about Jodi, describing her as a typical teenage girl, much like those in your own family or even like yourself when you were younger.
She was a bit of a, adventure seeker, and she was your typical 17-year-old girl. And to end that way, to me, is horrific. And I think anybody that can relate to it, that has kids, can relate to it. I think Jodi might have made some mistakes in her choices along the way, but what teenage girl doesn't? So it could have happened to any teenage girl in this case.
As her investigation into Jodi's disappearance progressed, Jenni got to know Jodi through her close friends and social media posts.
So Jodi was incredibly social, and anyone you speak to, like most people will say, I wasn't that close with her, but I knew her because she was always at the party. She was always she was a loud, engaging person. But her two best friends, Tiffany and Chelsea, they knew her, And it's funny to speak to Tiffany and Chelsea now because they didn't really get on back then. And so they're so close now, obviously, having gone through this together. And when I'm asking them for information about Jodi and they're looking back in their text messages or their old Facebook messages and sending me screenshots, it's we're all laughing at just how they would all phrase things to each other back then, or the language they would use. Because it's very weird to look at yourself as a teenager and it's a whole other person. But Jodi was just very, very social. Pete might have told you she had a lot of jobs. Working was very big, like Canadian Tire, Wendy's. She was always getting that money so that she could go to Bowen, she could go camping in Chilliwack, she could do the social things that kids from Squamish did. She posted on social media a lot. And if you look at her social media at that time, there was like things called Facebook questions, which would be like, who are you thinking of right now? What song are you thinking of right now? And she did a lot of those. And Zena and I have taken a real deep dive on those because you feel like you're interviewing someone that you've never met before.
Now, 17 is obviously a very young age, an age when most of us had no idea what we wanted to do with the rest of our lives. But we were curious about any goals that Jodi may have had or thoughts about her future.
But she's very clear that she wanted to get out of Squamish. She was over it, which I think a lot of small town kids, probably are. And she really wanted to go to California because her mom had family in California. And I think she just saw California as Hollywood sign, palm trees, sun, couldn't be further away from Squamish and couldn't be further away from the people in Squamish who were adding drama to her life. She had goals. She had goals of getting out of there. But see, in the same breath, those Facebook questions would be like, what is the thing that matters most to you? And her answer is my family. So it was not a get out of Squamish to get away from my family that I have a bad relationship with at all. She was obsessed with her family. She talks about them frequently in those questions. She looks so like her mom and her brothers. This was not a girl who wanted to get out of the small town and never look back. It was a girl who just had bigger dreams. And those dreams were not academic based by her school attendance record. But that's okay. Not everyone has to be a biologist,
So, as mentioned in the intro, Jodi had a boyfriend who she was last seen with. Gavin Thomas Arnott was an older boy that Jodi began dating when she was about 15 years old. He was born in 1989, making him about 3 years older than Jodi. Jodi met Gavin through her older brother Rob. He was raised on Bowen Island by his father Randy and his mom Lynn. Now, Lynn and Randy broke up when Gavin was about 10. Despite the separation, Lynn remained an active part of Gavin's life. Randy, Gavin's dad, is a man with heavy influence on Bowen Island. He is a multiple property and business owner. He actually owns Twin Island Excavating on Bowen Island, which is one of Bowen's largest employers. Randy was also a volunteer firefighter on Bowen Island, and from what we understand, the volunteer firefighters on Bowen hold quite a bit of influence, similar to a Rotary Club or an Eagles Hall. Eventually, Randy would remarry a Bowen Island resident named Carolyn. Now, Carolyn is also well known on the island. She's a local farmer, a painter, and a sculptor, and she's actually in charge of the emergency support services on the island. After the divorce, Gavin split his time between living on Bowen with his father Randy and living in Squamish with his mother Lynn. Gavin Arnott has been described as wiry and high-strung. Friends close to him at the time also described him as off or unpredictable and sometimes dishonest. His mom Lynn, however, paints quite an idyllic portrait of her son. She reminded a Vancouver newspaper that her son was a 4-time champion of the Test of Metal cross-country mountain bike race that takes place every year in Squamish. After he finished high school, Gavin did some work for his father, like renos and labor around Randy's properties. By age 20, he had lost his interest in mountain bike racing, and he had taken up partying. Many of the stories that involve Gavin involve a lot of alcohol.
Jodi started seeing Gavin when she was just 15 years old and he was 18. The relationship has been categorized as tumultuous and, at times, violent. One time on a camping trip in nearby Pemberton, Gavin and Jodi got into a disagreement in a hot tub. Gavin got angry with her and began choking her. To the shock of the other people there, Gavin would not let go of Jodi's throat. Another boy had to get involved by putting Gavin into a headlock and throwing him out of the hot tub. A week later, Jodi's brother Rob recalls seeing the bruising all over her body. Quote, "She was black and blue down her arms and around her neck from Gavin choking her." Jodi's parents instinctively knew that the relationship with Gavin was no good. They did their best to keep the two apart, but it only increased tension between Jodi and her family. At one point in the winter of 2008, Jodi stayed for a month with Gavin and his mother Lynn in her Squamish home before returning home to her own family. Lynn has publicly stated that this was a 3-month stay, while Gavin has said it was just 1 month. As tensions grew with both families over this relationship, Gavin and Jodi had limited ways to meet, so they'd often spend the night together in Gavin's truck. It is common in abusive relationships for there to be violent incidents followed by honeymoon periods of love bombing. This seems to be a similar pattern for Jodi and Gavin's relationship. Much to the confusion of her friends and family, Jodi always returned to her boyfriend. But Gavin's behavior was not just directed at Jodi. In early 2009, he got into a fight with his mother, Lynn, where he doused himself in lighter fluid and tried to set himself on fire. After authorities attended the scene, Gavin spent some time in the psychiatric assessment unit. On that matter, Gavin was prohibited from owning firearms. The affidavit reads, "I believe it is not in the interest of the safety of Lynn Fedoric or any other person that Gavin Thomas are not have in his possession any firearms, ammunition, or explosive substances." Then on April 8, 2009, Gavin and Jodi were sharing a meal. Gavin got upset at the amount that Jodi was eating and called her a pig. According to Gavin, she threw a helmet and a computer monitor at him. Gavin then jumped on her, violently assaulting her and dragging her through the front door of his family home. The police were called and Gavin was arrested and charged for the assault. Despite all of the ups and downs, Jodi finished her grade 11 year at House Sound Secondary School and looked forward to starting grade 12 the following fall. But before summer officially arrived, her case came before the courts in early June 2009. On June 5, 2009, Gavin entered a guilty plea to common assault and was given 18 months probation and was ordered to have no contact with Jodi. His father Randy referred to the assault as a misdemeanor that was blown out of proportion. This sentencing occurred just weeks before Jodi disappeared, but despite the no-contact order on June 5th, Gavin drove his truck to meet Jodi in Brackendale Park in Squamish just days after. Any family who has ever tried to keep a loved one safe can relate to the struggle that the Henricksons were going through. Imagine your teen daughter being hurt by a 20-year-old man, so bad that the courts had to get involved, and yet despite your best efforts, you couldn't stop her from seeing him. Jodi's mother even went as far as cutting Jodi's cell phone off in early June of 2009. This wedge that was created in the family is something that Jenni spoke about at length with us.
When we talk about that time period in her life, and when you sit down with her parents and talk to them about that time period in her life, it was terrifying for me. And what I'm about to say is not implying blame or accusing a suspect or whatever. I am talking about the fact that Jodi had a violent relationship with her on again, off again boyfriend at that time. That is public knowledge. It's public knowledge that she had a restraining order against him that had come into place a couple of weeks before she went missing. And I am not connecting what I'm about to talk about with her going missing. I'm just talking about this time period in Jodi's life. When you sit down with her parents, you see two people that desperately were trying to keep their daughter safe. And I could actually cry talking about it, because if you were to label Jodi a runaway at that time, the things that have come out for me over these conversations with people were, oh, well, yeah, she used to sleep in his truck a lot. They would sleep in his truck. And I was like, why would they sleep in his truck when they both live in Squamish? Oh, because he wasn't allowed at her house, or she wasn't allowed at his house, or whatever. And what I see in her parents' eyes is the last 2 years of her life being so tainted by this relationship. So, like, why do people not come home? Why do people hide things from their parents? Like the thing about cutting off her cell phone, like, her mom has to live with that. But as a parent, would I not have done the same? Like, you can't chain them to their room. Let's take a look at, like, teenage romance and teenage infatuation and the choices that all of us have made around that. And then you sprinkle in teenage domestic violence, which has been a huge education for me during this. And her family did the best they could to keep their daughter safe from a violent relationship. And unfortunately, and again, I'm not saying that this person did it, I'm not connecting it. Unfortunately, their attempt to keep their daughter safe resulted in their daughter pulling away from them. And I think that parents of teenagers all over the world, that is your biggest fear. And unfortunately for this family, that time period and the distance that it caused and the lies it caused her to tell has affected the rest of their lives. And it's really awful.
While Jenni explores the complex nature of intimate partner violence and teen relationships, Peter, who was at one time a father of teens himself, has a much simpler take on things.
And she was in love with Gavin, and she was going to go do whatever she wanted to go see Gavin. Obviously, they had some issues. He was charged. They weren't supposed to see each other. There was a restraining order against him. So she had a muddled view, I think, of who he was, maybe, which led her into a place that she shouldn't have gone, right?
So Jodi was in love, or at least what she thought love was, at such a young age. On the afternoon of June 19th, 2009, Jodi packed an overnight bag. There was a party that night at Gavin's best friend's house on Bowen Island. She knew that Gavin was going to be there. She knew legally that they were not supposed to see each other, but for whatever reason, she wanted to be at the same party as Gavin. In less than 24 hours, Jodi would be missing, and her boyfriend Gavin would be the last person to see her alive. We're now going to take a quick break to hear from our sponsors. On Friday, June 19th, 2009, Jodi told her parents a lie. She said that she was going camping with a group of friends at the Cultus Lake campground, located 200 kilometers away in Chilliwack, British Columbia. But Jodi had no intention of going to Cultus. Instead, she was going to a party on Bowen Island at Gavin's best friend's house. Whether it was planned between Gavin and Jodi is not clear. But what is clear is that she knew he would be there, and she wanted to see him. Only 2 weeks earlier, Gavin was sentenced to 18 months probation for assaulting Jodi. As a part of his probation order, Gavin was not permitted to be in contact with Jodi. However, the two had already breached that condition to meet in a park in Squamish a week earlier. Jodi packed her large black purse with everything she would need for a couple of days on Bowen Island. She put on a pair of blue jeans and a black leather jacket over top of a black long sleeve. At around 4 p.m., Jodi went upstairs to the family room. She said goodbye to her mother and her brother Rob. She seemed to be in good spirits, and there was nothing off about her demeanor. She then went out back to say goodbye to her dad, who was tending to his pigeons. She gave him a hug and a kiss, and said she would be home in a few days. Traveling down the Sea to Sky Highway towards Vancouver from Squamish is one of the most beautiful stretches of highway in the world. On one side are stunning mountain peaks, and on the other is the beauty of Howe Sound. That day, Jodi took the Squamish shuttle bus that transports people from Squamish 60 kilometers down the Sea to Sky Highway to the town of Horseshoe Bay, a municipality of West Vancouver. When she arrived in the small town of Horseshoe Bay, she departed the bus, and she then bought a ticket for the Bowen Island ferry.
Aside from being an adorable seaside village, Horseshoe Bay is also home to one of the main ferry terminals in the province of British Columbia. BC Ferries operates 3 ferry routes that leave Horseshoe Bay. One goes to Nanaimo and acts as a major connection between the mainland and Vancouver Island. The second connects to Langdale on the Sunshine Coast, and the third sails from Horseshoe Bay to Snug Cove on Bowen Island. This ferry terminal is very busy and is monitored by many CCTV cameras. Jodi arrived in Horseshoe Bay by bus that evening. She bought a ticket and waited in the passenger area for the next ferry to Bowen Island. Bowen Island is 6 kilometers wide and 12 kilometers long and located just a 20-minute ferry ride from Horseshoe Bay. Bowen Island is a lush, rich island with dense forests and rocky coastlines. Although it is geographically close to Vancouver, it can truly feel like a whole world away. With a population between 3,000 and 4,000 people, it has often been populated by artists, artisans, and hobby farmers. These more artsy types blend easily with the more salt-of-the-earth blue-collar residents. But during the mid-'80s, more upwardly mobile and financial well-off types began moving to the island. As the decades moved on, the island became a de facto suburb of West Vancouver, with many people choosing to commute to Vancouver for work and back to their island escape at night to raise their families. For teens like Jodi, Bowen represented a chance to meet and party with other teens from Squamish, Bowen, Horseshoe, and West Vancouver. The parties on Bowen gave them all a sense of freedom. The island only had a couple of RCMP members, and the roads were often safe and completely free of traffic. The parties often took place in the bush or at one of the many rental properties on the island. When the last ferry left Snug Cove at 10:20 p.m., a sense of freedom would come over the teens. No more mainland, no more parents, and most importantly, no more rules. Most parents knew about the Bowen Island parties and approved of them. After all, what bad could happen on a peaceful island?
The timeline is that we learned then is pretty consistent with what we know now. There was nothing. It's been fairly widely reported, the timeline. So basically, what happens is Jodi tells her family and friends that she's going to Chilliwack to go camping with a friend. She, in effect, her intention was to go to Bowen Island to see Gavin Arnott, her boyfriend at the time, or on and off again boyfriend, or however you want to term it. But she doesn't, she told a couple of friends that's where she was going, but most people believe she was supposed to be heading to Chilliwack. So she leaves, and at 8:40 p.m., she's seen on the Bowen Island ferry in the passenger zone. So we know that for sure. At the time, and this is probably relevant to future inquiries, is there's about 8 or 9 cameras in the Bowen Island ferry area, including, Horseshoe Bay. You're familiar with Horseshoe Bay and all that kind of stuff. So, and she was captured on, the only time she's ever captured on video is that moment on a Friday night, the 19th, at 8:40 p.m., and it's about a 10-15 minute ferry ride. So that would mean that she was probably arriving over Bowen sometime after 9 p.m. At 9 p.m., she goes to a party on Harding Road, and that's where Gavin is. And Gavin is already there. Gavin's been drinking heavily. I think he tells one reporter that he drank 12 Corona or something and a Mickey of booze. So he was quite intoxicated at this time.
So Jodi arrives at the first party on Harding Road. It was hosted by Gavin's good friend, Doug Harding. And Gavin is already there, and he's in bad shape. He's heavily intoxicated already, and this is around, 9-ish p.m. Jodi being at the same party as Gavin may have raised a few eyebrows. It was very well known among the group that Jodi was the subject of a protection order.
And then she went to the big party. And even then I say big party, like 20 people. This was like island kids. That party was hosted by her on again, off against boyfriend's very close friend. Some call him his best friend, some don't. So Jodi showing up there was not a good move socially. I think a lot of people who were from the island were like, oh gosh, and everyone knew that like this restraining order thing had happened. And I think there was a lot of fear among the teens of, can we get in trouble? Or like, when you're a teen and like you don't know. And so there was a lot of like concern, does her being here when he's here implicate like us in any way?
So when we say Gavin was heavily intoxicated, we need to get more clear. When Jodi arrived at the party, Gavin was duct taped to a railing and his pants were soaked with his own vomit.
Now, at some stage, apparently and this turns out to be relevant later on, he gets sick on himself, decides he's got to change his clothes. He goes to his truck, which he had driven to the Harding Road party, to get a change of clothes. He ends up, I guess, putting the vehicle in some kind of motion and almost hitting the house, which causes a disturbance with him and his buddies in the house. And they end up duct taping him to the porch to keep him from driving and take away his keys. So he's that kind of intoxicated. Jodi, we know, was at the party, and according to what we uncovered is she sees him at the party. She sees him in that state where he's duct taped, and she leaves at some point to go to another party 8 kilometers away.
After seeing Gavin duct taped to a railing and covered in his own vomit, Jodi got a ride to another smaller party located 8 kilometers away in an area known as Leroyville. We believe that the time is now around midnight. Jodi hung out at that party for a while. She then catches a ride back to the Harding Road party to check in on Gavin.
So she goes to this party, and then somewhere, and we're probably thinking that all happened, that altercation stuff was probably around midnight sometime, or 11. And then she goes to this other party up the road 8 kilometers away. She then comes back to the original Harding Road property, and it was probably what they described as the early morning hours. So we're thinking 2, 3, 3:30 in the morning. By this time, Gavin had been put in bed by his buddies, and she wakes him, and they start walking away from the Harding Road. Now, we have some information they got a short ride from the party, or just down the road for a little ways of the ride. But we don't know who that is that picked them up for that small portion. But it sounds like it was very short.
Gavin and Jodi left the party in the early morning hours of June 20th, 2009. It was the summer solstice, so the night sky was quickly turning into day. The sunrise that morning was 5:07 a.m. Gavin was helping to renovate one of his dad's rental properties on the island. This house was located on Eagle Cliff Drive, so it makes sense that the two of them would make their way to that house, even though the house was actually empty because it was undergoing renovations. Gavin did not have access to his truck at this time because his keys had been taken away from him due to the incident the night before, so the two of them caught a drive and were dropped off part of the way there. Now, another partygoer who was driving along the road near the elementary school, he saw the couple sometime around 5 a.m. Gavin asked him for a drive, but the driver declined as he had business to do in the city that morning. The couple are then seen one more time by 2 additional witnesses.
At 4:30 in the morning, he are seen together by an individual, and he stops and starts talking to them. They're wanting a ride somewhere. He's wanting to get home because he's got to get up in the morning for work. So he sort of deflects and says, nah, you guys go on your way. I'm not going anywhere, right? He gives some indication they wanted to keep on partying or go to some other spot or something. And he says no. So, and he sees them around the elementary school on Bowen Island. So that would, if you look at a map, it's pretty obvious where the elementary school is as they go to Seven Hills area. And then at 6:30 in the morning, they're seen at the top of Seven Hills, what an area they refer to as Seven Hills, which is around the Scarborough Road area. They're seen there by a couple that are on their way to the ferry, actually, to the 7 a.m. ferry. And they have no connection to either one of these parties. And they're pretty specific, and they knew them and saw them and they were still walking, but they described them as leaning on each other kind of thing. Now, that's the last time Jodi's ever seen. Is that 6:30 in the morning?
By now, Jodi and Gavin could have been walking for potentially over 2 hours. These roads are hilly and there are no sidewalks. They appear tired and or intoxicated, and the witness states they were leaning on one another as they walked. Now, this sighting has often been interpreted to mean that they were walking towards the Snug Cove ferry terminal. This would make some sense. Many people are trying to get to the ferry at that time of the morning to catch the first ferry, and had they been walking in the direction of the ferry terminal, this would have been the route that they took. But Jenni has since learned that the information regarding which direction they were walking was not accurate information, but rather an assumption that became widely reported.
And then she goes back to collect who she was seeing at that time. And they spend a lot of hours walking. It's public information. They were last seen at 6:30 in the morning by 2 eyewitnesses. That was Saturday morning. And I think this is just an example of the media at that time reported that she was walking towards the ferry, which I really never understood. Because, like, even if they did have an argument and they did go separate ways, Jodi had a lot of friends on Bowen, and she didn't have her cell phone on her, but there's a lot of people's houses she could have gone to, so I was always very confused by that. But the eyewitness actually corrected us that they were not walking south on Miller Road. They were walking north, which is away from the ferry, which cleared up a lot for us. Like, that one tiny piece of information and it being misrepresented in the media cleared up a lot for us.
So this small detail, walking to the ferry versus walking away from the ferry, was actually a crucial error, as the initial areas of concern were near the Miller's Landing turnoff where she was last seen and the Snug Cove ferry terminal, rather than the Eagle Cliff Drive location where the Arnott rental home was located.
It just shows you, though, that, like, one small misreport, if that had been accurate at the time, like, who knows? Because it shifts the area where we are now concerned about what the public saw and heard. Like, it shifts it towards, I think we've already said this publicly in our call for information as one of the areas that we're asking people about, but it shifts it towards Eagle Cliff, away from Snug Cove. Snug Cove is very populated. That's where, there weren't that many tourists at the time, but that's where tourists would come and go. It's the ferry terminal, it's the cafe, it's the pub. And people are like, well, I didn't see anything Snug Cove. So, like, whatever. But it shifts it. We're not talking about Snug Cove. And whether the police knew that or not, like, obviously I've not seen the file. So, like, I don't know if they had it right. I have to assume that they had it right. But the public had it wrong because the reporting had it wrong. And it's such a small detail, but you can't help but wonder if it was reported correctly at the time, who would have seen what.
Okay, so getting back into the timeline, according to Gavin, he and Jodi had heated words or some sort of argument on the side of the road, and then he left her there somewhere near Miller Road and Scarborough Road around 7 o'clock in the morning. This is what is referred to as the Miller's Landing turnoff. He said that after the argument with Jodi, he walked up the hill towards Eagle Cliff Drive and never looked back. And then he goes on to say that he has never seen her since.
She's with Gavin when last seen. He says that they get into a bit of what he describes as a bit of an argument. And he turns his back and keeps on walking to a rental house, which is further up the road from where he is now, past the Legion and into an area where he's actually supposed to be working for his dad, removing insulation from a house that they're renovating. The house, by the way, is completely vacant. There's nothing in it other than it's been raised up, and they're removing the underground insulation because they're going to pivot the house and put a new foundation and stuff. Now, Gavin says that he never looked back after she walked away, and that he went on to this rental house on the corner of Scarborough Road, which is about, I'm going to say, 5 or 6 minute walk from where the two of them were last seen. He goes to this rental house. She is never seen again. She's never seen on by any witness driving up and down, or anybody else going to the ferry. She's not on the ferry video during that time of getting on the ferry. And by the way, it would still be probably a 25-minute walk for her to go from the spot seen to the ferry. But you would pass lots of people in that process as well. But the ferry footage doesn't show her getting on.
So after a night of partying, Jodi and Gavin were seen walking in the direction of his dad's rental property. He states that the two had an argument on the side of the road and that he left her there, never looking back. This was around 6:30 or 7 a.m. on Saturday, June 20th, 2009. And Jodi Henrickson has not been seen since. You can listen to part 2 of the disappearance of Jodi Henrickson, which will be in your feeds tomorrow morning. We will discuss Gavin's movements the next morning, the investigation, the media reaction, and where the case sits today. Thank you for joining us for part 1 of the disappearance of Jodi Henrickson. If you have information about this case, you can submit your tips to findingjodi@gmail.com, and that's Jody, Jodi. You can fill out a Google Doc by going to @FindingJodiH on Instagram, or you can call 236-712-3349. All tipsters will remain anonymous. If you have information that you wish to give to the police directly, you can call IHIT at 1-877-551-4488, or to remain anonymous, you can call Crime Stoppers at 1-800-222-8477. If you or someone you love is a victim of intimate partner violence, we encourage you to seek services in your area or call 211 to access resources. We'll see you soon over on part 2 of this 2-part series. So until then, stay safe, everyone.
Stay safe.